Please don't clap. It's an honor to be able to introduce Dr. Carol DeVette as a part of Common Hour speaker today, who is the recipient of the Bradley R. Dewey Scholarship Award, which is the highest honor that we can receive as an F&M faculty member in scholarship. And before I read excerpts of her Dewey nomination, I just want to say a personal gratitude to Dr. DeVette for her generosity of time and wisdom to me as a mentor. I think she is an amazing role model for how to excel as an educator, as a scientist, and as a parent. So thank you, Carol. Professor Carol DeVette is a geoscientist whose research program has inspired undergraduates to pursue their intellectual curiosity while interpreting geologic evidence to expand their understanding of the ancient Earth. Her research uses clues from rocks to create a picture of ancient landscapes, topography, and climate, including the plants and animals that inhabited these spaces. Professor DeVette has studied ancient freshwater limestones all over the world, including Nova Scotia, Chile, Pennsylvania, Kenya, and Tanzania, documenting evidence illuminating various theories that help us better understand both changes over time and space to bring together broader understanding of many important theories in geosciences. She's published significant research at the world-famous Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, and that she has done so in collaboration with highly regarded researchers attests to her stature in the field. Professor DeVette and her collaborators have discovered and characterized freshwater spring deposits within the gorge that are likely the sources of potable water for hominids, which is an important piece that underlies the physical understanding of the evolution of humanity. Most recently, Professor DeVette has focused her research in the Atacama Desert, one of the most formidable environments on the planet, illustrating just how challenging sometimes it can be to do field work, and I think you will see some of that in her talk today. And it's notable that just last year, Carol and her collaborators, including 3 F&M students, published their research in the Geological Society of America Bulletin, one of the most well-regarded top-tier geoscience journals. So you can see that she's really an excellent, excellent researcher. That she has done this in partnership with F&M students is an indication of how education and research go together at a school like ours. She's recognized for high-quality mentoring throughout her career, and it's a hallmark of her role as a teacher and scholar. Students have accompanied Professor DeVette to the field in all aspects of the work, including collecting data and samples, preparing rocks for analysis, and then finally analyzing their geochemistry using cutting-edge analytical techniques right here on the F&M campus. She takes great pleasure in working at a microscope with students and participating in their delight as they interpret what they see and develop their own paleo-environmental reconstructions. Professor DeVette has consistently merged teaching and research with high-quality mentoring to inspire excellence in her students and enlighten them in the study of carbonate rocks and the stories that those rocks can tell us. It is because of this steadfast devotion to scholarly research at the highest level that makes her a worthy recipient of the Bradley R. Dewey Scholarship Award. I'm very excited to welcome her as our Common Hour speaker today. So.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, and it's a delight to be here. I want to take a moment, though, to thank all of my former and current research students. Thank you for the joy of working with you. I salute your dedication, your hours of hard work, and the deep thinking that accompanied our collaborative research. It is my honor to have received the Dewey Research Award and to share that honor with all of you. Well, begging forgiveness from my colleagues in the English department, what might be the similarities between Wordsworth's daffodils and this collection of data here? You don't need to see the details of the data. So maybe many of you know that every spring I teach my upper level geoscience class, and on one beautiful warm spring day, I say about 2/3 of the way through class, leave everything, grab your jackets, and we go sit outside right of this building by the topi area of F&M where the daffodils are in bloom. And I read to them. And one of the poems I read is Wordsworth's, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. And as I was trying to prepare this talk, I was thinking about what are the pieces that fit together for who I am over this long period of time, because I was a double major in English literature and geoscience. So I highlighted a couple of lines from Wordsworth that I think work well with students when they're feeling grumpy or tired. They can think about something. And I thought, this actually is what I do in geology as well. So Wordsworth pulls that lovely scene into his imagination, into his memory, and retrieves it when needed, in this case, particularly in periods of solitude. The poet sees this as a very positive state. Similarly, a geologist draws on knowledge gained through experience to interpret, in my case, ancient environments, including past climate conditions. In a sense, these are memories of stored information, which, coupled with a reasoned imagination, allows one to look into deep time. And as much as science is collaborative, particularly these days, for me, it's moments of solitude and reflection when the full picture emerges. So let's see how this works. So my research almost always begins in the field, gathering clues from the rock's past. So these are from my master's thesis. That was well before we had digital photography. So these are photos taken of 35mm photos in my thesis, but I worked up in Nova Scotia. And the first thing we do is observe what's there in the rocks. So you can see these little pointy bits here, and you can see these round circles. And so one of the things is, what are those? And when we're in the field, we're describing, measuring, collecting samples. Here's an example in 3D of one of those circles. And we make a stratigraphic column that illustrates graphically what we see in the field. And it turns out those are fossil logs. And sometimes things that we see in the field are easy to recognize. A fish is a fish. So here's a fish fossil, another fish, and there was a third one down here in a sandstone. But most of the time we have to look more closely. So as Dan mentioned, I use thin sections a lot. It's a 30-micron thin slice of rock. You can see through it, mounted on a glass slide that we examine under the microscope. Here we can see that this is a fish bone. So if we hadn't found those fish fossils, we'd be able to say, there were fish swimming here. These are algal laminations, and this is a fossil Charophyte Ugonia. That's a green algae that grows in fresh water. Those things collectively say this was an active, in this case, freshwater environment. What about some more details? Well, using the scanning electron microscope, we can see these very strange spherulites. It turns out these are silica spherulites that form in hot springs. So we're beginning to develop an interesting picture of what life was like 240 million years ago in that part of Nova Scotia. And we create these paleogeographic reconstructions. And here we can just see the logs that I saw. The fish are swimming around here, and there are these seeps and springs bringing hot water up through a volcanic base. So that's really fun. You pull all of that together, all those clues. But why is this important on a different level? Well, if we look in human history, after World War II, there was intense pressure to find oil, to fuel the civilian industrialization and actually the Western Europe and US economy. And a lot of oil was discovered in the Middle East. And that oil was housed in limestones. And those limestones had relatively high porosity and permeability. That's the holes in the rock and the connectiveness of those holes. Today, I think the search for water is potentially superseding the search for oil. But early on, it was a big issue. And yet, very little was known about the formation of limestones. How could it obtain porosity, retain it, recreate it? So this is an example of a quarry in York County. We'll come back to this. Here's an example of a freshwater limestone from the Atacama, and you can see lots of holes in it. It's a very porous rock. We can get porosity in other ways too. There are fractures in this rock and crystals that have grown, and there are spaces between those crystals. So in the 1950s and 60s, because so little was understood about limestones, there was a lot of going to the tropics to understand how these things formed. Okay, sign me up, I'll do that. Get certified for scuba, that was great. And one would go and actually look in these environments where we were seeing carbonate sediments accumulate, and those will eventually lithify to become limestone. So here's an example. We can picture this coral. It's sitting in the lab across the way. It's probably one of Roger's. And there are these little holes where the polyp was living, the little animal. And if you picture a sea anemone, a tiny sea anemone, that's what would have been living in each one of these little polyp chambers. So one day those chambers, after the animal dies, could hold a droplet of oil or water. And corals can live a long time, but eventually they become buried in sediment. And deep in the earth, the coral and sediment lithify and become limestone, and oil or water moving through the rock may be trapped in those pores. And luckily for us, plate tectonics may bring this back up to the surface so that we can use this as a resource. Of course, there is our own intellectual curiosity about limestones, and wanting to understand what an environment looked like 250 million years ago, for example, or 5,000 years ago, is an exciting challenge. And I think my students that have worked with me over the years have risen to that challenge and enjoyed it. But one of the more recent issues that's come up is trying to understand ancient climates, because our own climate seems to be changing so fast that maybe if we look into deep time, we can get a better understanding of our own future. So petrography, as mentioned, using these thin slices of rock under the microscope, tells us a lot about that porosity and when those pores get filled with crystals. And so then the rock loses porosity. So we have archives that we can go look at in limestones from the past. Understanding these complexities requires field work or drill cores, followed by, in my case, microscopic and geochemical analyses. And wonderfully, this is research that undergraduates at F&M can be deeply involved with and have been. So this picture illustrates just a few of their theses over the years and publications that they're co-authors on with me. But first, I'm just going to take a very little digression, because this is, I think, important. Andy and I were the first couple at F&M to share a position. And this allowed both of us to move our careers forward and have time to raise our family. Our 3 children have accompanied us on research excursions globally, and we're very grateful to F&M for their, and I use the word their because it was individuals, not the buildings, that made this decision. And they had a very forward-looking approach in 1989-90. This is a picture of our youngest, Cameron. He's now finishing his PhD at Vanderbilt, but that's in the outback of Australia. He loved it, had a wonderful time there. And then everybody a little bit older, our other 2 kids as well, in front of some beautiful cross-bedded sandstones in Colorado, telling us that had been a desert at one time. Because I feel so grateful for the opportunity to do research here at F&M with the support for our own research, I've always felt, and Andy and I have both felt, that it's important to pay this forward. So a little bit of my research time has been devoted to trying to help women in science in general, and particularly women and men interested in having families and keeping a scientific career going forward. And this paper was probably the most pivotal one that we published, because this was back in 2002, and this was very new information for people to see in one place. So I worked on this paper with a colleague and then a doctor here in Lancaster, OBGYN. And what we can see is on the vertical axis is the Down syndrome per 1,000 births and maternal age in the x-axis. And we simply plotted up the data here of the number of years. There's the median age at the time of getting a PhD, and then tenure track around 6 years. And notice that the steep increase that happens in this time period in terms of the percentage of miscarriages and genetic issues. And for administrators and department chairs, which at least in the geosciences in the early 2000s were mostly men, this was an eye-opening diagram. And I think it's been important in terms of things like slowing the tenure clock or stopping the tenure clock, or including family-friendly policies in institutions. And if you can picture, say, University of Oklahoma, this might not have been their first way to approach things. And I think this was a very helpful moment. Okay, back to research. So one of the projects I've worked on for many, many years was in that quarry in York County. So this is actually on the Western Australian margin, a reef very close to shore, but it's a nice analog for what we learned about this system in York County. Okay, first thing we have to do is turn our mindset a little bit. So North America is here, rotated around to the south, and there's the equator. And this arrow points to southeastern Pennsylvania, so York County, right where we are today. Notice that was a tropical environment. Would have been a great place to go for a vacation. There's a bit of Greenland stuck on here, some of Scotland, and some other parts making up a continent called Laurentia. Okay, the Ledger Formation is just the name given to this bunch of rocks that we're working on, and I went to this quarry on a geologic field trip, as one does. And the quarry geologist proudly showed off this wonderful rock called dolomite, which is a calcium magnesium carbonate, 50%, stoichiometric would be 50-50 calcium and magnesium. And they mine this out here and sell it to the steel industry to make refractory bricks. It can withstand very high temperatures. And then he took us over and showed us this worthless part of the quarry where they hit a patch of limestone, and it's just calcium carbonate, calcite. And this had no commercial value to them. But to me, this was fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And they had pulled off the topsoil so they could see if it's what they wanted, but it exposed this amazing karst topography. So when fresh water falls on limestone, as you know here in Lancaster County, it dissolves it to some extent, and we have these beautiful pinnacles that we could go walk around in. So I said, can I work on this and bring some students? He said, sure. So over the years, this turned into a major research project for me, and we learned a lot about some of these important questions. So we're back in the Cambrian, 510 million years ago or so, and what was it like then? And then what happened after these rocks formed? They were buried and brought back up again. And does this give us some kind of new model for, there's a long word for organosedimentary construction, it's just saying a reef complex? And are there any modern analogs we need to really think about in terms of our world warming today? So one of the wonderful parts of this is that the dolomitized area, that rock that they were quarrying out, consists of these little features called ooids, little rounded grains that are forming today and roll around in the surf zone. And some of these contained a very interesting nuclei. We'll see more of this in a minute. This is a fibrous submarine cement. It grew on the seafloor. And the fact that we see it here means, these are these clues we pulled together, it must have been growing, broken off in a storm, and then reworked as the nucleus of an ooid. So that tells us that's a very early cement, and that's important. Okay, here's the pinnacles, and we can walk down in there and find a three-dimensional view of the inside of this deposit. And for scale, there's a tractor trailer in the back. It's a big area. Well, these rocks were very enigmatic. All the geologists that had come just scratched their heads and walked away. I said, well, let's see if we can find anything we recognize. Here are stromatolites. These are little cyanobacterial buildups with calcium carbonate. And we knew about these from the modern. So here's Shark Bay in Western Australia, a famous location for modern living stromatolites. These are intertidal, so when the tide goes out, they're exposed. When the tide comes in, they're underwater. And it turns out the cyanobacteria that make these have been around on the Earth for billions of years. There are submarine ones as well. These were found in the last couple of decades in the Bahamas, where they're all the way underwater. The living surface is just on the top edge, and underneath it's rock. It's hard as a rock. Okay, so we found stromatolites. We're like, whew, okay, we know what those are. But a lot of the other rocks there were this kind of what we call, just in joking, a shag carpet. It was this dark colored microbial material with light colored cavities inside of it. And let's take a closer look. So I was wandering around the quarry and saw this puddle and it had all this algae growing on it. And I thought, that's it. That's the analog, except the ones in the Ledger Formation must have been secreting calcium carbonate, so they would turn into rock. And that's what we see when we look more closely. Turns out lots of microbes were making this deposit. Here, these are a more cocoid form, little rounded ones, and then some are finely laminated. And then these exquisitely preserved shrubs. These are 510 million years old, and there they are preserved in the rock, absolutely beautifully. Then we were seeing other curious features. So here's the microbial host rock, top and bottom. Here's a little knob of it. And look, that's getting encrusted with a new set of microbes. And microbes are growing down from the ceiling of this cavity. And then this is sand that has washed in and lapped up onto the little knob. And finally, the rest of what was an open space has been filled with this fibrous calcite cement. And we can see that again in this one. Here's the microbial growing, top and bottom. The sand washes in. And then in this little corner is a different kind of cement. This is a late cement that in the United States out west, they refer to as saddle dolomite, because it has a curved crystal face. In Europe, baroque. So I prefer the baroque. Isn't that wonderful? That's marvelous. Yes. Okay. It turns out that what we were documenting here and publishing on was really a new kind of reef complex. Instead of made of corals, which had not evolved at this point to build large structures like this, we were looking at reefs, like you might think of a coral reef today, but made out of microbial material. That was very, very new and unusual. One of the fun things inside of this reef, those fibrous cements I showed you, was that some of them have a crenulated fabric that has been termed herringbone cement because it looks like what's in a nice tweed jacket. And this was described early by Sumner and Grotzinger in '96, and then our paper came out about this in '97. And here's one little anecdote. The world goes round. I love it. So last year, my senior research student finished her project with me on rocks from the Atacama Desert, and she's been accepted and is attending a graduate program, University of Tennessee, and her project is to work on herringbone calcite cement, because almost nothing's been published since we wrote on it. She's like, I found all your papers. It was so great. Yes, that's fun when that happens. Okay, so here are these cements. And these are the sort of normal fibrous ones. And then here is a very thick section of these herringbone ones. And again, this was something new because the Grotzinger and Sumner work had said these have only occurred in very, very old rocks, much older than the Cambrian, and only if you had anoxic seas, conditions where there was no oxygen in the ocean. And we're looking at our rocks here and saying, no, these are intergrown with regular marine cements. We don't think this is an anoxic change here, and these rocks are younger. So clearly there's more to the herringbone story than met the eye. We can use isotopes of oxygen 16 to 18 ratio to give us a paleo temperature. And it turns out this baroque dolomite that's in the middle here gives us quite a high temperature, 300 degrees C. And that's important as we go through the story here. Okay, so the quarry geologist was at this point saying, well, you figured out a lot of mysteries about this site. That's great. Now help us with this one. So the quarry, every so often, would hit these patches of what they called white marble. It's not a marble, it's just a white limestone. But they didn't like it because you couldn't sell it. And then they'd sometimes hit patches of red mudstone. And that was really terrible. And so he said, why is this here? What's going on? Well, it turns out that there's a major fault across the back end of this quarry. And that fault is linked to rifting that happened in the Mesozoic, the time of the dinosaurs. And there was a big pull apart here down eastern Laurentia, North America, similar to what's happening in East Africa today. And this fault was letting fresh water come into these rocks and dissolve it. And that was creating these cavities that were then filled with red mud. But the white marble part remained a mystery. And we can see that in a nice polished section, some lovely herringbone, here's a crack filled with some of that red mud. And then the crack is even cracked and broken. So all of this is an active tectonic environment at the time. So we made some thin sections of the white marble. And the stain that I use, alizarin red S and potassium ferrocyanide, turns calcite pink if there's no iron in it and doesn't stain dolomite. So we started to see in the thin sections that we had dolomite, that's what the quarry fellow is all about, but every so often it would turn back into calcite. It got de-dolomitized, and that's another topic that's not received that much attention. So we ran some geochemistry. We have an inductively coupled argon plasma spectrometer in the other room, and that just gives us a way to get the chemistry of parts per million, what's in these rocks. And most of the components that we drill out using a handheld micro drill came out about the same, not too much variation in there. Magnesium, a wide variation in manganese, but the white marbles, that calcite, de-dolomitized calcite, plotted at a very tight field. And when we plotted that against the delta O18, the oxygen isotope versus temperature curve, we can see that most of the isotopes were reset during burial. Oxygen resets very easily as you warm the fluids up, but this is much cooler water. So when we're here in the white marble, the water temperatures from which those crystals grew was much cooler. Aha, the story comes together. So we'll just go through this super quickly. We start in the marine world 510 million years ago under the water in the tropical seas. We bury those rocks. Magnesium and strontium are lost. We can see that in our geochemistry. During burial, deep down, fluids get pushed up through the rocks and do the dolomitization. They add magnesium into the rock. Now, why would we have areas in the quarry like this that are all dolomite and, lucky for me, the reef areas that are still calcite? The dolomite, remember, is made of little ooids. And if you picture a box of ping pong balls, that's what that was like. It's easy to move fluid through there. Lots of pores and porosity. The reef, remember, we've seen is already full of cement. The crystals have grown and filled up all the pores. So this water moving up through the basin hits the reef, can't get through there, and is diverted into the ooid shoals and dolomitize the shoals while leaving the reef as calcite. And then it's near the getting up towards the surface at this point, brought back up, and then we have this big rifting event and all the tectonics. And what that does is open this up enough that fresh water comes in, rainwater, surface water, dissolves some of the dolomite and the limestone, precipitates this or builds in this red mudstone, but also then moves through the rocks to some extent and creates these patches of de-dolomitization of calcite again. So that was a fascinating story. So we're looking at, I don't know, 400 million years of interesting things that have happened to those rocks. And the students and I had a lot of fun working on that. This is a wonderful quote from a famous sedimentologist. Reefs are like Shakespeare. The plays go on, only the actors change. And through the past, we can see that reefs have been built by all kinds of different things before we got to the modern corals. So we have this microbial reef. It probably was pretty smushy to touch when you were swimming over it. Is there something we can learn from this today? So coral reefs, as you know, are in peril today. The oceans are warming and acidifying. Overfishing is taking out the algal grazers, the kinds of fish that eat algae, and nutrient loading, sewage and runoff from the land is bringing in fertilizer, essentially, for macroalgae. So in the modern, there are people who've suggested we're going from a coral-dominated system to an algal-dominated system. So my question is, would we be returning to the past? We're not going to go through the chemistry here, literally just to say that excess CO2 in the atmosphere diffuses into the ocean, reacts, builds carbonic acid, but that breaks down and we end up with excess hydrogen, lowering the pH and making them more acidic, the ocean more acidic. And so corals, healthy corals, have color to them because they host a little symbiont algae called a dinoflagellate inside their tissue. And if the water gets too warm for a coral, they literally expel this symbiont. And thank you to Peter Fields for speaking in my class for a couple of years about this. The details of that are fascinating. But when that happens, the coral loses its color and becomes bleached. And this can happen to whole reefs if they're sitting in hot water for too long. And the coral gets most of its nutrition, 90 to 95%, from its symbiont. It's photosynthetic, it just makes sugar and feeds the coral right there. When it bleaches, it's really on its own. And most of the time the coral dies unless it can take a symbiont back in again when the water cools quickly enough. Okay, so that's rough. So we have overfishing, which depletes the algal grazers, nutrient loading that fertilizes algae, plus weakened corals. So we are seeing, here's in Indonesia, what were flourishing coral reefs being smothered and taken over by fleshy algae. So perhaps our view of the reef from the past is an indication of where we may be headed in the future. Okay, let's switch now and look at freshwater limestones. So we were in the marine world for quite some time, but freshwater limestones, those that form on land, continental, tell us more about paleoclimate. And one of the interesting set of rocks I've been able to work on was from Olduvai. Now, Olduvai is not an easy place to get into, and the politics of the anthropologists and archaeologists and geologists that work there are such that that's the one place I couldn't go in the field to find the rocks myself. My colleague brought them back to me. So here we are in the East African Rift System. This part of Africa is moving away from this part. The red rectangle is Olduvai Gorge. And the gorge houses about 2 million years of sedimentary record. And that record is full of fossils, all kinds of creatures, not just hominids, and then a lot of volcanic material. And this volcanic material can be dated. So Olduvai is very special for so many reasons, but one of them is that we have very clear age control there, which we often don't have in regular rocks. And actually, Bob Walter worked on some of the age control for Olduvai years and years ago. So my colleague noticed when she was there that there were 3 important archaeological sites that also had this white rock there, this tufa deposit, which was a limestone. So she said, would I work on these? Well, we have to understand what's going on in Olduvai, and that is climate variation back and forth from wet to dry, or dry to wet. And this is something linked to orbital cycles, Milankovitch rhythms for the planet. It's not anything unusual, but in Olduvai, it means that when we had a dry time, not much rainfall coming in, we just had little springs being deposited on the edge of the famous Paleo Lake Olduvai. And during wet periods, the lake expanded and would cover those areas. Now, Leakey and others were convinced for a very long time that the hominids were there because of the lake, that they came to the lake to get water. But the plot has thickened. So we can see examples in the modern on the edge of the high mountains where water is ponded up at spring sites. So we have this as a modern analog. And so my colleague went in the field there and she said, I can trace these tufa beds for a ways. Here's a trench for the archaeologists, there they are. But these tufas are not widely continuous like the lake beds are. There she is collecting the samples. So she sent them to me and I made the thin sections and we had a look. So here's our friend the charophyte again, this fruiting body Eugonia from a freshwater algae. And they're alive today. We can find them in very hard water lakes. And then also snails, gastropods. Okay. And then a little ostracod. There are a bunch of little ostracods. That's a little tiny freshwater bivalve. So it looks like, based on the fossil evidence, that the water in these limestones, that the water from which they formed, was potable. It was good to drink. And the geologists at this point had actually worked on the Lake Olduvai sediments and said, you would not have wanted to drink that water. It was saline, and sometimes the minerals forming in there may have been actually toxic. So that was not a good water source. But the springs and seeps would be. Well, there was still pushback about this. So we did a nice plot of the carbon isotopes versus the oxygen isotopes. The point being that our plots were very different from modern soils, because some people had said, oh, those are just soil features, and very different from the Paleo Lake, the ancient lake deposits. And these actually have their own trends telling us that we had their own separate plumbing system underground. So we have a paleogeographic reconstruction, as we do, and at dry periods, we were getting these seeps or little springs coming out and precipitating the limestone. And those, it turns out, hosted woodlands, and we saw that in that modern analog, and that meant that there was a dependable water supply of water that was safe to drink. There were fruits and tubers, lots of food there, sleeping safety in the trees, and animal protein opportunities. So as much as these are dangerous places, there's lots of other things hunting there, it does look now like these sites were the main water and food supply for early hominids. And there certainly were times they were using the lake water, but there were times when that would not have been a viable option, and the springs and seeps would have been better. Okay, so that was an important, I think, contribution to that conversation. And then we're going to switch now and look at freshwater limestones that formed in the Atacama Desert. And the Atacama is one of the driest places on Earth. There are some dry valleys in Antarctica that might have less precipitation, humidity, but this is a pretty arid place. So the top picture shows a person for scale here, and then flat-lying beds that are the rocks that we worked on for a couple of years, grouped as the Apache Formation. And there we are with some students in Chile. Just briefly to get ourselves organized in terms of geography, we're here in northern Chile, and there's a coastal range of low mountains. Here's the Pacific Ocean, and then a little depression, a basin, another mountain range, then the big depression, and we worked here in the Calama Basin, and then the high Andes themselves. So it's a curious place with high mountains and low basins. And that's important in terms of unraveling this story. The blue lines are rivers, and they're called rivers, but as you'll see, they're quite small. So what are the questions we were concerned about here? How did these limestones form? We need water to make freshwater limestones, and we're in the desert. And did this give us some insight into when the Atacama went hyper-arid? So hyper-arid is more than just arid or semi-arid. There's no water. There's one little story that says it would take 1,000 years to fill a teacup with water in the Atacama, but it would all evaporate before you got there. So it doesn't rain until recently. And where did all of that water go? And the world's largest copper mine is, open pit copper mine is here in the town of Calama, and they would like to know where all that water went because they need a lot of water. Okay, just to give you a sense of how dry it is, this is a little seep. Once there was a waterfall here, but there's just a little seep of water coming out, groundwater, and this precipitates as halite. So that's salt, these little pillars of salt. That's how dry it is. And 2 students are here that went to the Atacama with us last summer, and they know the inside of your nose bleeds, your lips crack. It is not an easy place to work. So good for you guys. Okay, here's what it looks like on the everyday. And this is one of the rivers, the Rio San Salvador. We might call it a creek or a stream, and it's down cut through this package of sediment and volcanic material over time. Here's an outcrop where the students and I are working, and Andy's backpack there, taking the photo. And these are all these layers of freshwater limestone. And we log this centimeter by centimeter, and we can see quite a few changes through that 30-meter section. We can see storm deposits, and we can see some things that we recognize, like stromatolites. So that was exciting to find our friend, the stromatolite. These are freshwater stromatolites, but they're still cyanobacteria, precipitating calcium carbonate. And here's some snails, lots of little snails. And another student over COVID time worked on the samples of the snails. Chinchilla, thank you, Roger, for helping with that one. And our friends, the ostracods, are here too, lots of little ostracod shells. So we know, again, this is a good freshwater environment, not saline. And on our scanning electron microscope here in the department, we have a fragment of an ostracod shell with another feature on it. We look at that more closely, and that's a diatom. Diatoms are tiny algae that build a silicate skeleton, a test made of silica, so it doesn't dissolve like the calcium carbonate does. And so we have a diatom specialist who works with us. And then we, of course, run the geochemistry. This is across that same section. And we can see here that iron and manganese do not vary very much, but we have a lot of variation in magnesium and strontium. And these are coming in from the volcanics that are weathering in the area and bringing those elements in the fluid. We also found some features that were kind of exciting in that the lighter brown here is the limestone, and then every so often we found these features where a storm event must have been rushing across the landscape, scouring down and eroding the limestone and carrying very large blocks. So remember, we're in a place where we're battling this idea that there's no water. But you can't do that kind of thing without a high energy flow. So there certainly was water in the past, much more water. And at the top of the section and all of the different locations we looked at, we find mud cracks. And mud cracks you've all seen when you've looked in a puddle somewhere after it's been drying out, right? That the sediment actually cracks apart and makes these little polygons. And that's indicative of something that was wet and is dry. So we can see that in our reconstruction, we develop it from when there was a shallow lake here. We have the diatoms and we have the ostracods, all those things telling us that we had a nice lake system here. And eventually it dried up. It was gone, leaving those limestones that we saw. And here's a section through another part where we have all of those limestone lake beds and then the modern river here at the bottom. There's geologists there for scale. So one of the big questions in this region is when and why do we have this hyper-arid environment in Chile? And by the late Miocene, so that's only a few million years ago, maybe 8, the Andes seem to have reached much of their current height. So that's all plate tectonics, the Pacific plate going down, pushing up the Andes mountains. But the rainfall must have changed because in the rocks beneath the lake, there's a lot of this sand and gravel. So a lot of rainfall must have been bringing this material down from the mountains. But that's slowing down and shutting off, except for occasional flood deposits. That gives us a chance to build this lake. And the lake was long-lived, maybe 3.5 million years. So there was a lot of water collecting there for a significant amount of time. We're not going through this slide. The point is only that there's a lot of argument about when the Atacama became hyper-arid and why. Lots of arguments. The structural geologists say the mountains got so high, they made a rain shadow, no water could come across from the Atlantic. It would hit the Andes and rain. And so the other side where we are working, the western side was dry. Others saying, no, it has to do with the currents offshore. Well, our work that we published in 2 different papers really helped tie some of this down. So we had strontium isotopes that indicated that a lot of the water that we were seeing was actually coming from the Pacific. Now the Pacific is much closer to this basin, but remember there are these little mountain ranges that would be blocking the water. But at this point early on, those mountains may not have been as high, allowing some moisture transfer. And we also saw the evidence of these storms. And the fact that we had these storms tells us there must have been surface runoff. In other words, some rain falling in this area at the time. And that is really not the case now. But we did see overall, as we go up in time, it gets more and more arid. And this we're linking to a sort of re-amping up of the cold Humboldt current that goes along western South America now. And that cold water means that not very much water vapor evaporates from it, so it doesn't get across. So I think that, again, these 2 papers were an important contribution. So we've been down to the Atacama a couple of field seasons, 4, 5, and we kept seeing these other interesting rocks, sort of a brown color draped over the Apache behind them, and that's Andy for scale up there. And we thought, well, let's go do another bit of research on that. What's happening there? So in the desert, the colors are very flat. It's very hard to photograph the rocks. So Andy put a little extra color on this, but there's me looking up at the top of this. I don't think it's that hard to imagine water pouring down over that cliff. It's a fossil waterfall. And it's produced calcium carbonate deposits that are essentially frozen in time. And you can just imagine that water pouring over the cliff. And clearly, these rocks are much younger than the Apache. They're on top, so they must be younger, but there was more water there. So we've been working on these rocks for the last couple of years and have a couple of publications out. Also beautiful beds of reeds that were fossilized. So they're encrusted in calcium carbonate, and there they are just about the way they looked when the plant died. And we can run our chemistry, and we can look at the stratigraphy and get some age dates using uranium thorium dating. And we can say there was certainly more water in the landscape, tens of thousands to even 100 years ago. So there is a woman in the town that one of our colleagues spoke with, and she remembers when she was a little girl, she's a grandmother now, but she used to go to the site where I was looking at that ancient waterfall and play in the pools there. So the water situation has changed dramatically in the Atacama. So here's one of the modern little rivers or streams, and we can see that at one point it was much bigger. This is that fossil waterfall again, the draperies here. All of this is this limestone that forms from fresh water, particularly when it's evaporating into the dry air. But in the Atacama, it's rained recently. Now, this was a real shock to the people that live there. And the roads are mostly dirt in the area where we are, and so they washed out, and then there aren't very many bridges across, so people were isolated. And the biologists from farther, well, I guess everywhere, farther afield, all gathered to see what was happening in the Atacama after these rainfall events. It was so exciting. And one of the curious findings was that the microbes died. Instead of the water being a good thing for them, they were so adapted to hyperaridity that that much water actually caused that little ecosystem to collapse. So it's fascinating. But in the past few years, these rainfall events have started to happen. And we're wondering, is the Atacama, as climate changes, going to be a place where instead of getting drier, it's starting to get a little wetter? And that's going to be a lot of adaptive change if necessary. So our work again shows that it wasn't that long ago that there was more water there. There were ecosystems that had evolved in that, and maybe they'll be returning to there. That's an unknown. So let's pull some things together. And again, my apologies to the English department for my very simple view of Wordsworth, but Wordsworth noted that observation and experience, memory and interpretation can provide the viewer with insight into themselves, but in my case, can also yield new information about Earth's deep past. And these limestones that I've worked on for so many years record both marine and terrestrial conditions at the time of their formation. And then their history reveals much about the changes that they've been through or the environment maybe that they've experienced. Many, many thanks to Franklin and Marshall for COG grants, Hackman grants, lots and lots of research support. The Geoscience Founders Society, which is an alumni affiliated group with our department that also provides funding, and then to Andy, who makes everything work. Any questions? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carol. Is there anyone who would like to come down and ask a question of our presenter?
Hi, I'm a faculty member here, and I have a question. You use the word cement a lot, and the way that you use it does not describe the way that I think of cement. Can you explain how you think of cement? Thank you.
Yes, that's an excellent question, and is one that in my classes, that's usually where we start to explain things. Cement here in the geological world means crystals that have grown in place to hold a rock together and to fill pore space. So it's not the same as concrete, which makes sidewalks and buildings and things. So cement here is used as a set of crystals that have grown in place. So it can be silica, quartz, makes a lot of cement in rocks. Then you get a sandstone, what's very hard with that quartz cement in it. Or the limestone, where it's usually a calcite or a dolomite. It's a little bit softer. But excellent question.
Who's next?
Is the recent rainfall coming from perhaps some warming in the Pacific off the coast?
The question was, has the recent rainfall come from warming?
In the Pacific? That's a very, very good question. And I think that's one of the things that we're working on a lot. There's new data that's coming out that shows that not just surface waters in the ocean, but deep waters are also warming, and that is changing circulation patterns, because of course what drives ocean circulation at this point in our minds is the contrast between warm surface water and deeper cold water. And as the cold water is warming, which was a bit of a surprise, it is changing those conditions. So I think you're onto something there. Right. right?
Don't be shy.
So Carol, I'm a staff member, but also have been a student of geology here. On that slide you had of where you first talked about Baroque, I was just curious, it was in centimeters, I think, how many thousands, millions, whatever of years, hundreds of years are in each of those layers?
Well, that-
And I'm sure each sample is different. Like, how do you figure out what that time frame is?
Another good question and a challenging one. Trying to get time out of sedimentary rocks is difficult because they don't have the minerals in them typically that we've been able to use for dating. Now, a few new techniques are coming out, uranium thorium being one, and uranium lead for a little bit older. So we're working on that. It's expensive to get those dates. So what we've done in the past is look at sort of modern depositional rates. How long does it take for a pond to fill in with sediment? And you probably have all seen that happen in your lifetime, or at least get much shallower. It's pretty imprecise, and especially when we're looking at something that formed so long ago that we don't have a clear modern analog for. So those cements, the fibrous ones, probably grew fast, and those we can find in a few places in the modern tropics growing. And by fast, I mean over years. The Baroque dolomite, our sense is that grows very slowly in hot water at depth. And by depth, I'm talking multiple kilometers of burial. So 1, 2, you took sedimentology. I remember having you in the class. Yeah, so we are looking at very slow growing large crystals at that point. Good.
I'm a staff member. How would you, you said you had 2 fields of study, was one of them literature? How would you say that your literature studies from a liberal arts perspective impacted your geological studies?
Oh, a wonderful question. I think that I was trying to use Wordsworth as an example of that, but it's a way of, in both areas, taking either words or objects in the field and finding the message in them. So in the rocks, we're finding the message that's there in the poem or the piece of literature, the essay or the book. We're looking for what's the message that's written in there. And we have to be able to decipher that carefully. In literature, of course, the joy is unpacking the language, right? And careful, close reading and finding what the meaning is that the author was trying to convey, or taking our own meaning from it as well. And in the rocks, it's pulling these pieces of information out of it and then trying to build that story. So yeah, wonderful.
We do have a couple of questions from our viewers on Zoom. One is from a faculty member who says, F&M has made valuable progress in developing family-friendly tenure and employment practices, and your colleagues appreciate your contributions to these policies over the years. What do you see as some next steps we should be taking to continue this progress?
Wow, that's a loaded question. That's a heavy question. You know, in some ways, my answer would be to defer to the younger faculty members who are coming along and dealing with new issues that weren't around probably when we were raising our family. I think the technological world has shifted so many things. It's certainly changed the way that we may think about teaching. It may think about the new ways that we think about parenting. So I think that's a place where some new minds need to think about that. How would we make all of those pieces come together? And I think the working from home part had lots of good things and lots of very difficult things about it, but maybe is part of opening that window to see what the next world would look like. It's a great question, and I don't have an easy answer for it because I don't think it's an easy one.
Anybody else here want to ask a question? Come on down. We have a quick question while she's coming on down from faculty. It says, can the general public hike and explore the pinnacles at that karst site in York or somewhere like it? It looks really cool in your photos.
That's interesting. The quarry geologist that I worked with retired and then hired a wonderful young woman who's their quarry geologist now. I don't know what the answer to that would be. It may be that, yes, now and then, if you make some pre-arrangements, you could go out and have the geologist walk through that with you. She's very interested and amenable to public, but I don't think you can just turn up and walk around through it because there's a lot of heavy equipment going on around that site all the time. But it was a fascinating place to work.
Hi, Carol.
Hi, Lauren.
This one. I'm a student. In class, you always said, and you made a point in your presentation, that the present is the key to the past. What has been one of your favorite discoveries you've made, or something big that revealed the past?
Oh, that's a great question, Lauren. So she asked, what have I seen in the present that has taught us more about the past, I think is where you were going. So one of the issues I didn't really delve into was the microbes growing inside of cavities are growing in semi-darkness, right? They're inside of a submarine cavity. And that was something that biologists used to query me quite a lot on, is how is this happening? The modern stromatolites grow in sunlight and photosynthesize. So it turns out, and this was a little hard to track down because it's mostly in the French literature, but there were French geologists and oceanographers working in Tahiti in caves in the limestone under the tropical islands. And there they were finding calcifying microbes. Now they tend to have a red color, that's a long time ago. That red pigment can absorb sunlight at lower wavelengths, so it was allowing them to photosynthesize even in semi-darkness. So my sense is that these microbes we were seeing in the ancient must have had some kind of similar adaptation, some ability to continue to grow even under very low light conditions. It's not completely dark because sand is washing into these cavities. So sand can come in, some light can come in. It's all very shallow. You probably could snorkel right over this reef system. But that's been an interesting question. And Lauren, to your point, it was finding that in the modern that helped us at least begin to understand some of the ancient.
Well, it's 12:30, so I want to thank Carol again for her wonderful presentation. And thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you next week.
Thank you.